Good evening. Welcome to Photo Live with Peta Clancy in conversation with Clare Needham. My name is Elias Redstone and I'm the Artistic Director of Photo 2021 International Festival of Photography, which will take place in Melbourne and across regional Victoria from the 18th of February to the 7th of March 2021. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which I live, and I pay my deep respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you everyone for joining us for Photo Live as we invite photographers and artists to discuss the social and cultural role photography plays in our lives. Photo Live is supported by Creative Victoria and the Australia Council for the Arts, and expands on Photo 2021's festival theme, exploring the relationship between photography and the truth. Previous talks are available to watch on photo.org.au, and the final talk in the series will be with Chinese Malaysian artist Minstrel Creek, which will take place this coming Monday at 6 p.m. Today, however, it's my pleasure to introduce Peta Clancy. Peta is a descendant of the Bangerang people from southeastern Australia. Her photographs explore notions of the real and the perceived, and seek to challenge the viewer to focus on what might never have been noticed. Peta is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at Monash University in Melbourne, and was awarded the 2018 Fostering Koori Art and Culture Grant from Koori Heritage Trust to research massacre sites on Dja Wurrung and Bangerang country. The resulting work is currently on display in the exhibition The Burning World at Bendigo Art Gallery, alongside work by Hoda Afshar, Rosemary, Laing and Michael Cook that draws upon colonial histories, fact and fiction to consider the landscape as an amorphous political site. Peta will be joined in conversation with Bendigo Art Gallery curator and the curator of The Burning World, Clare Needham. So let's welcome in Peta and Clare. Hi.
Hi, Elias. Hi, Peta.
Hi, Claire. Hi, Elias.
Good to see you both. I'm going to disappear and let you guys get on with the conversation. Just so the audience knows, they are welcome to ask questions at any time using the chat comment function, and we'll be asking these towards the end of the talk. Anyway, enjoy. I look forward to hearing it and speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for the introduction.
Hi, Peta. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the Tangerang and the Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm coming to you live from this evening, and also the Bendigo Art Gallery is located. And I'd like to pay my deep respects to their leaders and elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that also to First Nations community that are here today. So let's start by talking about your work, Undercurrent, which is currently on display at the Bendigo Art Gallery in the exhibition The Burning World, as Elias mentioned. Elias also mentioned that this was part of a Fostering Koori Art and Culture residency program grant through the Koori Heritage Trust that this work first emerged. And it was to research massacre sites on Dja Wurrung country in central Victoria, which is right near Bendigo Art Gallery, or Bendigo Art Gallery is situated upon, but the site itself is quite close to Bendigo Art Gallery. Yeah. Working closely with traditional owners, namely Mick Burke and Amos Atkinson. You spent a year visiting and documenting the unmarked site, which is now submerged underwater.
Yes.
And you learnt the land and its hidden stories, and you explored the site. I guess I just want to see whether maybe you could start talking a little bit about that process of spending time on country and working with Mick and Amos and the Dja Wurrung community to explore the site that you chose to be the site that you would spend the year with to produce the work Undercurrent.
Yeah, sure. So when I first started the project, I was interested in exploring a number of different sites, massacre sites on Dja Wurrung country. And originally I thought I would explore various different sites. But as the project went along, I found it was kind of much more honest and much, I could go in a lot deeper if I explored one particular site. And stepping back, when I first approached Rodney Carter to work on the project, he we went through a process where a lot of negotiation occurred in terms of how I would approach exploring these sites. And I also needed to apply for a cultural heritage permit through Aboriginal Victoria for permission to research massacre sites on Dja Dja Wurrung country. And through our conversations, Rodney Carter and I, Rodney Carter is the CEO of Dja Dja Wurrung Clans Aboriginal Corporation. Through our conversations, we worked out that the best way to get community involved was to put a call out to the Dja Dja Wurrung traditional owners community and to ask people who may be interested in talking to me or may be interested in working on the project in some way. And we put a call out, and Mick Burke and Amos Atkinson contacted me because they've been researching massacre sites on Dja Dja Wurrung and also Bangerang country, or Yorta Yorta Bangerang country, for the last 15 years. And so we kind of came together to share knowledges. And I'm not actually a traditional owner of Dja Dja Wurrung country. My ancestry, as Elias mentioned, is Bangerang. So I felt, very kind of honoured that Mick and Amos came forward and to let me into the stories and the tragedy of their family histories and of their country. And so we met up and we spent quite a bit of time on country and going around to various sites. And some sites are incredibly unassuming, like some of the sites we went to were, just like a paddock. But this particular site that we went to was really very evocative. And we went there and it was a really grey kind of day. And we spoke about how traditional owners would live on the river, and because that's where people have lived for thousands of years, and that's where food is, and but how the terrain had been changed since settlement. And the particular site that we were at was one that had been flooded, so the river had been flooded since settlement. And so this meant that the actual site of violence, the massacre site, is underwater. And so the fact that it's underwater was really kind of evocative and a metaphor for the repressed nature of massacre sites more generally, the knowledge of massacre sites and the kind of conversation around the knowledge and the acknowledgement more generally in Australian society. But also Amos, we were standing there and Amos happened to say that it's really good that the site's underwater because it's cleansing the area. It means that people can't actually walk on the site, and so it's protected. So it's protecting the spirits of the ancestors. So this site felt very evocative, and so I was drawn to working with this one site and to getting to know it, but also allowing it to speak to me. So I decided to spend a period of time over about a year, going every week or so and visiting the site and walking and spending time in the site over many different seasons. So that, and I kept in contact with Mick and Amos, and we worked closely throughout the process of developing the project. And on the there's actually an interview that we did that's on the Bendigo Art Gallery website, so people can listen to that. That was
really interesting interview actually too, because it talks about the site and it talks about the perspective on the site. So Mick and Amos are coming with the very different perspective perhaps to someone else coming to the site, and the way that the site is viewed, and this sort of idea of these layers of history that are covered over by the water, but also covered over and denied, and the histories that are denied, and the way that you have brought those histories to the fore and really amplified those in this really respectful and beautiful way. These deeply traumatic histories that you've been able to navigate and bring into the gallery space through your photographic practice. And you, in terms of that sort of split view, and you've used a really interesting technique of being on site and photographing and then cutting your photographs and then re-photographing. Maybe you could expand a little bit more about your process and the way that you worked with the site in that regard.
Yeah, sure. So I've just got some of the images on sharing some of the images, if you can see some of those. So when I started to go on country at this site, I started firstly by photographing the site with my 5.4 camera using film, and I was thinking about the light, hitting the actual film, the light on country hitting the film. And then I wanted to get a sense of two different time frames, two different histories, two different ways of understanding and reading the landscape. So I decided to print the original photographs that I took and take those prints back into the landscape, and to actually take them to the exact same site where I'd taken the original photographs, and to stick them up onto like a frame that I created, and to then cut into the actual photographs, so that on the horizon line there is a sense of a scarring, which gives a sense that there's like two different histories, two different time frames within the one photograph. And I also wanted to have a sense of that two different time frames and two different histories and two different times when the photograph was taken in terms of imaging and a vision of that particular site, so that when the audience looks, or the viewer looks at the actual photograph, they see the landscape, but there's something, it's the whole landscape, but there's something that's not quite right within the landscape. So there's that aspect, but there's also a very performative aspect in terms of taking the photograph back into the landscape. So, and then cutting into it. So I was very interested in the line where the two photographs intersect, and for that to very much be seen as a scar in the landscape.
And it is, in a way, it's a construction of an image as well, isn't it? You're not looking at a landscape that's right in front of you. You've got this disruption and this construction. So it's a photograph of a photograph.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
And so it sort of unsettles and fractures. You're looking at this, and you're re-looking at the landscape in a very different way, and acknowledging more than just what you would see in front of you if you were standing on the site.
Exactly, because you've got that layering and that sense of the two different time frames, but also the sense of the different light and the different seasons, different time of day. So each of the different photographs were taken at different times, and so you've got this collision of two different images of exactly the one landscape, but just imaged at different times. And so that it's a fragmented image of the one site, and it gives a sense of as you said before, Claire, seeing the landscape in two different or multiple different ways, the way that you mentioned about how Amos and Mick would actually see the landscape quite differently, that particular landscape, that particular site, and multiple other different sites around Dja Dja Wurrung country, very differently to how people who are going and might be water skiing on the water, or who might be holidaying, or so there's multiple histories that kind of fold into each other across the land, across country. And this was the way that I chose to explore those different ideas.
Mm. And it's it'd be interesting maybe to hear you talk a little bit too about how you really amplify those very traumatic histories in a way that really honours those who have such a visceral and ongoing connection to those stories as well. And you've talked a little bit about the sort of I guess the weight of that significance and responsibility as well, and how you tell those stories. And
Yeah, well, it's a very, obviously they're incredibly traumatic stories that are carried through over many, many different generations, and that are very visceral and felt, by people who visit sites to this day. And actually going on to, as I said before, like, I'm not a Djadja Wurrung person, and so working with massacre sites on Djadja Wurrung country, is a very, it's a very traumatic kind of thing to think about. And also I'm kind of given a lot of trust to actually work with these stories, or to work with the particular story that I worked with. And I wanted, I want to do it very, very respectfully. And it was really interesting when I showed the work in the Koori Heritage Trust gallery, and Auntie Faye was there. So a number of elders and traditional owners from Djadja Wurrung country were there, and I was really nervous, and I felt like I was really kind of not sure how the work would be responded to, but people really responded in a very honoured kind of way, that I'd worked respectfully. So, I mean, it's something, that I felt that I was given a lot of trust, to be given these stories and to be taken around by Mick and Amos and other traditional owners, that I felt that I wanted to make sure that I was very respectful, and because it's an incredibly traumatic, history that we're dealing with in Australia, that is throughout Australia. So yeah, it's a very, very traumatic history, and it's really important to kind of to do it in a way that's honouring traditional owners, and another way that is really important is to do it in a very collaborative way. So I worked very closely with Mick and Amos and Rodney Carter, who I mentioned before. So that was really important as well. So yeah, I was honoured to be entrusted with those stories.
And interesting too in the techniques that you've used as well, in that you are standing in front of a landscape, an image of a landscape, but you're also disconnected from that landscape a little bit too, in terms of the the two images that come together, and you've got the past and the present coming in together into the one image, and sort of speaks a little bit also about the impossibility of really representing the fullness of that trauma within an image.
Exactly. Yeah. When we spoke last week, we were talking about how it's absolutely impossible to represent that sense of that trauma in an image, and it kind of talks about the impossibility of that idea. But I think by having that fractured landscape, it is kind of jarring, and viewers may, you don't know exactly how viewers are going to respond in front of images, but it enables people potentially to question what they're looking at, and that there is that kind of fractured line. So it is jarring. But yeah, it's totally kind of impossible.
Maybe touch a little bit more on collaboration too, and if you'd like to show, I saw a little flick before of some work that came just before the Undercurrent series. You were talking about, your very deep experiential relationship with sites and with histories, and in order to bring those to the fore, really spending time in exploration. And perhaps we're going to talk a little bit about the Aurelian series that came before the Undercurrent, and how that informed the Undercurrent process and practice.
Yeah, sure. So you can see this on the screen. These are the butterfly works. So a lot of my work, I worked for a number of years on a project called The Body is a Big Place with another artist, Helen Pynor, and we worked very closely, and we undertook a number of residencies exploring organ transplantation, human organ transplantation. And we actually spent time at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney in a heart and lung transplant unit, actually visiting heart and lung transplant operations. And so in my practice, it's been really important to have a number of different experiences and to go in quite deeply to a number of different situations to inform my work. So that's something that's kind of carried through for a number of years. So you're kind of touching on two different points. One is the kind of experience of going deeply into different locations and different areas and in terms of the different projects that I work on. But the other one is when I was actually conceiving, working on the massacre site project, I came across the Victorian Aboriginal Massacre Map, and that outlines about 60 different massacre sites that are throughout Victoria. And it was put together in 1988 for the bicentenary by the Koori Heritage Trust. And I wasn't aware of the massacre site previous to coming across that map, and it's kind of an underestimation of the amount of violence throughout Victoria. But it was incredibly shocking, you know, as it is. And at the same time, I was working on a project where I had been photographing threatened and endangered butterflies and moths at Museum Victoria. And when I looked at the specimens of the butterflies and moths in the drawers at the museum, you know, they're alive and where they kind of lived, and the entomologists had captured them and brought them back and immobilized them and put pins through them and kept them in these drawers, these immaculate kind of drawers. And I had this feeling that I really wanted to take them back to the sites where they'd actually been taken from. And underneath the specimens on the labels are written where the butterflies were actually taken from. So I spent quite a period of time visiting the sites where the butterflies and moths had originally been taken from, or, you know, where their habitat. They live in quite localized habitat. And I couldn't actually take the specimens back to where they'd actually lived previously. So what I did was I visited the sites and I collected soil, and I used the soil to actually create backgrounds to then photograph the specimens on. So the backgrounds in these photographs are soil that I collected from the sites where the butterflies have been taken from. And I found that kind of collision of, you know, collecting soil and visiting sites and finding the massacre site made me really aware of, you know, in a visceral way, of the violence that occurred across Australia, and more particularly Victoria, where I've grown up, and realising that areas where I had spent my childhood and travelled around, there had been incredible violence. So it was just that kind of collision of collecting soil and, you know, having it in my hands, and then, yeah, finding the massacre map that kind of really drew me to wanting to explore particular sites in such a way.
And I guess, and that sort of, in terms of that staging of a background as well, and the layers and the platforms for viewing images as well. There's a beautiful installation there with the wallpaper behind the work, and that's what you've continued as well through the Undercurrent series in terms of your immersive installations and creating that sort of contemplative space, and a three-dimensional space too, using sound as well to really sort of place the viewer in that landscape and in that story and in that shared history.
So I use, in the installations, I use photographs that I've taken at the site to print them onto wallpaper, to then mount the framed photographs onto, so that it creates an immersive space, so that people's peripheral vision is totally immersed in the landscape. And it's also to kind of emphasize the idea of layering of histories. And when I first conceived of the idea of using the wallpaper and the framed photographs on top, I was thinking of having lots of different layers of photographs to kind of suggest multiple layers of history. But as the process went along, the images became a lot less layered. So I ended up just having kind of one framed or two framed photographs. Although at Bendigo, I've got 4 framed photographs on 2 wallpaper prints. But the wallpaper is to immerse the viewer into the landscape, but also to further emphasize the layering that is in the actual framed photographs. And the sound that I have is taken from a hydrophone that I used. Well, actually, it's a collaboration with my husband, Zane Milky. We used a hydrophone because I wanted to see what the sound would be like underwater at the massacre site. I mean, I knew that there wouldn't kind of be anything, I didn't know what the sound was, but I didn't think it would be kind of ghostly or anything like that. But it was just that idea of wanting to record the sound under the water. So I got a hydrophone and we recorded underwater at the site. So that's what the sound is. So the sound's at Bendigo as well.
And interesting too with the wallpaper, also at Bendigo Art Gallery, you've flipped the image as well, so it's upside down, and you get this sort of sense of disorientation in the landscape as well, and this idea that a fixed idea or a dominant view of a history or a story, isn't actually what it seems or how it's been told or perpetuated. The same with the stories of the story of the site. It's not actually what it seems when you're standing in the site. There's so much more to it. There's so many more layers, so much more of a story to be acknowledged and brought to the fore.
Yeah.
And that idea of the disorientation within the exhibition space as well, really, for the viewer to contemplate that.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I was also thinking about the like flipping the images was a reference to the fact that the site is underwater, and I was kind of thinking of this massacre site kind of inverted because it's underwater, and also thinking about the whole the experience for people living through kind of massacres, like at the time, like settlement, invasion brought on a whole life that was turned upside down. I mean, I guess that's a really kind of simplified way of saying it, but that was just kind of a few different thoughts that came into my mind. But that sense of disorientation as well is something that's really important, and the kind of upside down, the fact that the massacre site's at the bottom of the water.
You talk about the upside down. So Peter and I, you and I had the privilege of working with Natasha Carter, who's a Jarjarang artist and curator, in the development of the display or the presentation at Bendigo Art Gallery. And so Natasha selected works from Bendigo Art Gallery's historic collection to hang in conversation with your work, and also incorporated some components that spoke to your horizon line as well, and talked about Jarjarang country being about upside down country. So there's been so much mining and so much extraction, Jarjarang country, that there are a lot of artifacts that would have been under many, many layers of, thousands of years worth of layers of soil are right on the surface, and this sort of bringing from what's underneath to the fore and to the front. So perhaps you could show some images of the install. Thanks, Peter. And Natasha's picked up on the horizon line of your work also and carried it through with a gold and quartz line, which runs through the historic works in a scar, like a scar through the gallery, much like the scar through your work as well in the landscape, and also like a timeline and marking the points and that dramatic change at invasion, and then the settlement that ensued from there, and the changes in the landscape and cultural connection.
Yeah, and the fact that the country was turned upside down through the gold but also the idea of seeing like the quartz was really important for Djadjawurrung people, but for people who were seeking gold, where you find quartz, you find gold. And so they kept the gold, but threw the quartz away. So it's another way of seeing the country being upside down, isn't it?
That's right. And she speaks also about the resilience of the Djadjawurrung community as well, and that timeline being that, you know, the continuing connection to country and the continuing cultural practice and connection to stories and history as well, and that the line running through the shared history together in this land, and the acknowledgement and the bringing, then amplifying and bringing to the fore the story of the land for thousands of years before Europeans came.
Yeah, it's really interesting that Natasha chose to follow the horizon line, and also when just a little bit about the actual space that we chose to work in. When I first went to the Bendigo Art Gallery to look at potential sightings for the work in terms of gallery spaces within Bendigo Art Gallery, we walked into the Bolton gallery, and so it's the colonialist space, and you know, it's kind of the images that were in there were very kind of historical, but very kind of settler views of you know, the gold, what the opulence of that the gold rush had brought in terms of the buildings and the development of the area. And I was with Jess, the director of Bendigo Art Gallery, and I said, oh, you know, we were kind of like, oh, what if we put the work in here? And I think it's really interesting and to actually work in that space where it is traditionally the kind of colonialist space, and to kind of come into that space. But you worked quite closely with Natasha in terms of selecting and curating the actual works from the collection. What was that process like?
Yeah, I mean, it was such a privilege to work with Natasha. She's a really beautiful and very thoughtful approach in looking. So she spent a lot of time looking at the collection and the works that we have in our collection, specifically that are around the gold rush, so the 19th century works in our collection. And we have quite a lot of very sort of epic, romanticized paintings from a very Eurocentric view, and that, you know, values that were brought into the landscape from that time, and you know, some of the ways of presenting the landscape, you know, in terms of what's overlooked or denied as well. And she was very interested in picking up on some of those lived experiences, and went less for the heroic, epic paintings and more for those hidden stories, and the landscapes that showed the images that showed what the landscape would have looked like at that time. And so really interesting, thinking as well about those, the resilience of the Djadjawurrung community through that time as well, that there are, you know, thinking about the way that the landscape changed, but then also the way that the way that she was able to bring those stories to the fore. And she's the line through the space as well is also about that disrupting of the dominant view, or the way of looking at artworks as well, and really viewing and looking in and thinking about who's in the images, how are the images, you know, what view is the image of, what's being depicted in the image, and starting to question as well and think about how those histories are told, and, you know, the things that are sort of shape the way that we perceive the stories as well.
Yeah, it was a really interesting process working with Natasha, and seeing which works she selected, and also well, I haven't had the opportunity because of lockdown to actually install the work or see the work, but I really hope that I do get to experience it. But seeing you know, my kind of response to the landscape in the context of Natasha's interpretation. Yeah, I was really excited by the opportunity of working with Natasha and yourself, and also working in the actual site of this colonialist gallery space, because as we were kind of mentioning, you know, the absence of traditional owners in the kind of pictorial history in Victoria is terrible. And so to kind of bring that in and to respond is was an honour, and it's really interesting. And really rich to kind of have my work in the context of works from the collection, and my work in terms of kind of bringing something that, you know, kind of talking about massacres and working on a massacre site, and acknowledging it, whereas in these other works, you know, they probably are, and there is kind of, you know, there was so much violence that occurred specifically in that area because of the gold rush. You know, it just would have been absolutely horrendous and just totally, you know, people just rushing through and just, you know, trying to search for gold, and traditional owners just being overthrown, you know, incredibly violently and without any kind of law and order. It just would have been horrific. And looking at some of the historical documents that that I looked at when I was researching the massacre sites, you know, you could kind of, it's specific in terms of how the area was settled. You know, if people just wanted to go in and just kind of find, you know, they needed a particular area that they needed to search for gold, you know, there would have been just no hope for people. It's just horrific. It just a thought came to mind, which isn't totally related. Well, it's totally related, but when I was visiting one of the sites with Mick and Amos, and we travelled through country, and we were going across a bridge, and I'd already been to this one particular site that I have documented in some archival records. And I said to Mick and Amos, I think I've been to this area before. And I got out the records that I had, and we stopped at the site and we read the record, and it actually specifically described what we were looking at. You know, there was like a rundown stone hut and a hill over to the right. And this was a site that had been recorded, and the Chief Protector had gone through a year later to kind of investigate this recording of this particular incident. And you know, it was really, really eerie. I was going through with Mick and Amos, and we went onto the farmer's land, and we were walking through, and we looked down, and Mick found a greenstone axe. Just happened to find this artifact at that particular moment at that site. But what was really fascinating was what came after, is that Mick and Amos are really interested. They work with land, and they also work as fireys as well. And Mick's really interested in using fire as a means of healing country. And Mick's working on a process of actually going back to that particular site we went to and doing a ceremonial burning with traditional owners and ancestors of people who were victims of that particular massacre, and doing a traditional burning to enable the area to heal. So using fire in a you know, a healing ceremonial way. Yeah, that thought kind of came to mind when I was thinking about going through some of the records of the archival records. But the site that I worked with for the work for Bendigo Art Gallery wasn't, it's not kind of, I didn't learn about the site through archival records, it's through oral histories. And it's an unmarked, unnamed site. Yeah.
In terms of the in terms of looking at archival documents and marking of histories and amplifying First Nations communities across Australia, but also in terms of your projects and how you facilitate that and collaborating. Perhaps you'd like to talk about the next Undercurrent series that came after the one that's currently on display at Bendigo Art Gallery for the Monash Gallery of Art, which is a different approach again.
Yeah, sure. I was invited by the Monash Gallery of Art to do a commission for a project called Portraits of Monash, Ties That Bind. And there were a number of other artists who were invited as well, Ponch Hawkes, David Rosetsky and Lee Grant. And each of us chose to work with different aspects of community within, so generally, more broadly, the idea of community within the city of Monash. And I chose to work with Boonwurrung community and also Woiwurrung community to explore some of the, well, originally I was thinking whether there were any sites of violence that were recorded in archival material that had occurred in the city of Monash. And the more I looked into the archival records and the more that I spoke to traditional owners, I realised that the area has been so heavily settled that thousands of years of culture seem to be, I don't want to say lost, because there's, traditional owners who are living today, Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung owners, traditional owners, but the onslaught of and loss of culture in that area is just incredibly astounding. And so for many, many months when I was working on this project, I was at a loss because it just felt like culture had been erased. And it wasn't until I found, I've just got some in-store photos of this installation that has been on display at Monash Gallery of Art since the 15th or the 12th of February, and it's still on display because of the lockdowns. But I was at a loss because of this erasure of culture. And it wasn't till I found a map in Land of the Kulin by Gary Pressland, and it's a map that shows how the terrain actually looked prior to settlement. And one aspect of the terrain was the Dandenong Creek, and the Dandenong Creek runs through the city of Monash. It runs from the Dandenong Ranges through to what used to be Carrum Swamp. But I actually found that the terrain of or the trajectory of the Dandenong Creek hadn't actually changed since settlement. And so this was one, waterways. I was really interested in working with waterways, again, as I had in several other previous projects. And so I basically worked with this map, and I met with Gary Pressland and spoke to him about sites of significance in this particular area in the city of Monash, and also sites of significance along the Dandenong Creek. And there were several sites of significance. One was it was a trackers, so an Aboriginal trackers camp that I visited on the Dandenong Creek. And there's also at the end of where the water runs into the what used to be Carrum Swamp, was a very important place where Boonwurrung people actually gathered food, and there are also ceremonial sites in the area. So I was very interested in the idea. It was very difficult to kind of work with the idea of erasure, and when you kind of trying to research something and you're drawing a blank, but that was something that I kind of embraced, and I ended up working with the same idea of layering different perspectives, as I did with the previous photographs, where I took two different images of the same landscape and overlaid those different views. I actually worked with reflections along the Dandenong Creek, and I was actually planning on taking photographs and then taking them back into the landscape and cutting into them. But this sense of erasure kind of called a different approach. And when I went to photograph at these significant sites on the Dandenong Creek, it was the day after there'd been the huge smoke that had engulfed Melbourne, and then it had rained, and all the charcoal had and the ash had fallen into the water in the Dandenong Creek, and so the water just became black, and so it was like a mirror, and it was really strange. It was kind of like these fragments of kind of history coming through this dark mirror, and so I photographed the reflection of the landscape on the water, and that's how I managed to get this kind of layering effect for this particular work. So this has a very, very different feel because it's about kind of an absence, and so it's a kind of, it's about how to make work about something that is so rich and so deep, but where the threads have been kind of lost, or where, as people talk about, languages, Aboriginal languages that haven't been lost, they're actually sleeping. It's really strange to talk about the idea of erasure, as I mentioned before, erasure of a culture, but when there's traditional owners who are, living and a part of that culture. But just it's just terrific thinking about, thousands of years of history just being, erased through such heavy settlement in that area. But there is a scar tree which is photographed. You can see in this installation image, there's a scar tree which is in a park in Mount Waverley, and that scar tree was actually relocated from, it was actually had to be moved for the widening of Springvale Road. So there is a fragment of kind of traditional culture that's actually been dislocated, moved from one spot to another.
I feel like we could talk for hours. So rich projects that you work on, Peter. So beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing all of those insights. We're coming to the end of the talk. There's a couple of questions that have come through though from the people that are listening in tonight, and if I could just read one to you, Peter.
Yeah, sure.
This is a question from Dominic Mersch, who wants to, so he says, I feel like you're a bit like Gerhard Richter, and he's been changing his topic so many times. And so have you, looking at the breadth of your practice. And so what's next?
Okay, so when I was working on, so there's a couple of things, working on these projects, kind of going in like with the Judgewarang, I should say hello, Dominic, firstly, and thank you for that question. That's a really good question. I feel like these projects that I've been working on in the last few years is something that's going to, there's so much wealth and there's so much depth and breadth in these projects. But there's a couple of things with this Monash Gallery of Art project. I feel like with the two projects that I've talked about, I feel like I've just skimmed the surface. So I'd like to dig a lot more deeply in terms of the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung history of the city of Monash. But I've also been invited to work with some ancestral sites on Bangerang country. So my family ancestral country, and so that's something that I'm really planning on doing as my next project. But I feel like these projects are becoming so kind of deeply embedded in me, and they're so they feel so rich, and I'm entrusted with these deep kind of knowledges that there's so much more for me to work with this material.
Thanks so much, Peter. I'll just get you to unshare your screen while we finish up at the end, so everyone can see our faces.
I know. Elias did say unshare your screen, and I thought I had, but I was just so kind of carried away in talking.
Oh, it's so beautiful to see the images, though. It was there's such great install images. So much.
Just seeing my face.
So the Burning World is currently, the gallery is currently closed. However, there's a lot of things online you can see. So there's lots of content. Natasha and Peter have got a really great conversation that you can find through our website as well about the installation. There's the interview or the conversation between Peter and Mick and Amos. And there's lots of really great video content as well, and some walkthroughs of the exhibitions. There's lots of ways to engage with the Burning World. And you'll also be able to see the amazing work of Hoda Afshar, Michael Cook and Rosemary Laing, which are on display accompanying Peter's work in the Burning World. So thank you so much for joining us all live, everyone, tonight. And thank you so much to Photo 2021 for hosting us as well. And thanks, Peter.
Thank you so much, Claire. And thank you so much, Photo 2021 for inviting me. And thank you, Claire, for working with me and for being so wonderful to work with as a curator. I think the work's come up really, really amazingly.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, thank you.